The Nintendo DS was an insane console. I have spent years and way too much money collecting and playing as many DS games as I possibly could, and I regret absolutely nothing. So today we're looking at the insane life of the Nintendo DS to see if this console was actually that good. During the mid-2000s, Nintendo shifted their focus from creating the most powerful gaming console on the market to trying to create the most engaging and innovative gameplay experiences possible. And what better way to innovate gaming than to add a second screen?
By Odin's beard, there's two of them!
In late 2003, Nintendo announced it would be releasing a brand new gaming product in the upcoming year. But what fueled the fire even more is that they stated it would not succeed the Game Boy Advance or the GameCube, which wasn't really the case because the DS ended up being a successor to the Game Boy and it could even play Game Boy Advance games. But I guess Nintendo gets an A+ in semantics. In January 2004, the console was announced under the code name Nintendo DS, named after the system's dual screen function.
Well, if it ain't broken, don't fix it, I guess.
This is up there with the GameCube for being the most literal title of all time. Maybe someone got upset with Nintendo when they bought a Game Boy and they got this instead of getting this. But either way, compared to the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo DS was a monumental leap in quality. As it was so accurately titled, the DS has two screens. The top screen being a standard display, but the bottom screen was a touchscreen. This was Nintendo's first touchscreen console, which later became a trend through most of their releases. But with Nintendo trying to innovate the gameplay experience, the touchscreen was a beautiful idea. Being able to split a game up between a top screen and a bottom screen, along with enabling touchscreen functions, made it so a lot of games were able to do things they never would have been able to before. And though a lot of the games that ended up using this were extremely gimmicky, there were a ton of others that used this incredibly well. When the DS was originally unveiled in 2004, people were very skeptical about what Nintendo was trying to do, but that all changed when E3 2004 rolled around. Nintendo came out swinging, showing how powerful their new handheld truly was. They showed off the brand new Metroid Prime game coming to the console, something that was completely inconceivable on the Game Boy Advance. We got to see Super Mario 64 running on it, which at this point had only released 8 years ago, going from running on the N64 to now being playable on a handheld. They announced the console would have support for all Game Boy Advance games, which made it so on launch it already had an incredible lineup of games available, and they even revealed upcoming games like Animal Crossing DS, New Super Mario Bros, and Mario Kart DS. So needless to say, when this console launched in November 2004 in North America, it was already set up to have an incredible legacy. Launching the DS first in North America was a really good idea. Black Friday's the holiday where parents from all over the country get together to fist fight at Walmart over a 10% discount. And you know Nintendo wanted a piece of that bloodbath. And with PlayStation's handheld the PSP coming right around the corner in early 2005, it only made sense for Nintendo to beat them to the punch both literally and figuratively. The DS had 6.5 games available at launch.
How is that even possible?
Most of the games available at launch weren't that great. I don't think anyone was lining up on Black Friday to get Madden NFL 2005 for the DS. So of the 6.5 games, only 1.5 of them were really worth anything. The first and most prolific being Super Mario 64 DS. In just 8 short years, Nintendo was able to take their groundbreaking 3D platformer and hydraulic press it into this microscopic cartridge. Now, being called Super Mario 64 DS is a really stupid name, because this wasn't just Super Mario 64 available for the DS. It was pretty much a brand new game with some reused assets. Unlike the original, you can now play as Mario, Luigi, Yoshi, and Wario. They added a bunch of new levels and minigames, and they upgraded the character models to look more modern than in the original. The fact that they got Super Mario 64 running on the DS in 2004 to begin with is impressive, but the fact that it was a launch title made it even more impressive. During the early days of the DS, it felt like Nintendo was trying to get a home console feeling on the go. And what better way to do that than to get one of their most popular games of all time on the console? I can't say Super Mario 64 DS is the best way to experience Super Mario 64, because honestly, it's really its own separate thing. And the other game that was making people go crazy was Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt, the demo.
Are we rationing games here?
The launch day edition of the DS came with a pack-in demo for Metroid Prime Hunters, a game that would not even release until 2006. I got this when I got my first model of the DS and I was so excited to play it, but then I realized it was just a demo. I guess it was better than nothing, but I played this and wanted to get the full game and then forgot about it until the game actually released. And then when the full game was available, I just ignored its existence. And I ended up getting the full game a few years later and I really enjoy it. I wouldn't say it's the best Metroid game out there, but it's better than a demo, I guess. Having a pack-in title that was a demo of a game that wasn't going to be available for a while was just a weird decision to me. The DS is lacking a few things that I think would have helped this game and Super Mario 64, and that's a joystick. Playing these games on a D-pad just doesn't feel as natural as it could. But even though playing these games on the DS made me feel like I was sanding off my fingerprints, it felt like I was taking my home consoles on the go for the first time ever. And that was enough to make me love the DS from day one. And though it launched really late in the year in 2004, there was still one more feature that came with every single DS that helped it really stand out, and that was PictoChat. I think PictoChat was a plague to elementary schools during the early 2000s. PictoChat was a messaging service on the DS that allowed up to 16 people to communicate at one time. This wasn't anything crazy, but it was still one of my favorite things on the console as a whole.
Where is the mustard? This is like the 4th time this week. Okay, but I'm only telling you over PictoChat because I don't want Big Brother listening. Fine, I'll go check it quick. Why was it in the bathroom?
But having the entire Game Boy Advance library, some great launch titles, and PictoChat was the perfect amount of things to hold people off until 2005, where the DS finally started picking up some steam. A lot of early DS games were kind of weird. Nobody was making games for a console with 2 screens, let alone one of them being a touchscreen. So while some of these games have aged really well, others have aged like milk. On Valentine's Day, we got WarioWare Touched, which is kind of a weird name for a game. It makes me feel like I should ask Wario if he needs help. Just like in the other games in the WarioWare series, this is a collection of micro games where you play them back to back, and every so often they'll speed up the games to make it more challenging. But the major difference between this and any of the WarioWare games prior is that with the DS, there was the ability to use the touchscreen and microphone to make these games a little more interesting. Sometimes you'll have to blow in the microphone, others you're using the touchscreen to do certain tasks. And though I'm not usually a fan of games that make me blow in the DS's microphone, I can honestly say this worked really well. Now this is one of my favorite WarioWare games of all time, but back in the day I had a major issue with this game, mostly because I would consistently lose my stylus, and trying to play any of these games using a finger is like performing heart surgery blindfolded. But if you have any ability to keep track of your belongings, then I'm sure that wouldn't be an issue. In March we got Pokémon Dash, definitely one of the Pokémon games that came out for this console. I'm a huge fan of Pokémon, don't get me wrong, but this game is as fun as falling down the stairs. This is a top-down racing game where you play as Pikachu and you race through checkpoints trying to complete all of the checkpoints on a course. As an idea, I absolutely love this game, but when it comes down to actually playing it, I would rather eat a frozen stick of butter. The way this game violated my DS's touchscreen is crazy. I get they were trying to use the touchscreen in innovative ways, but this was not the right kind of innovation. And for some reason, this is called Pokémon Dash, but you can only play as Pikachu, and I don't think it would have killed them to add one other character to race as. I would love for them to revisit the idea of a Pokémon racing game, but if it's anything like this, I will cry myself to sleep more than I already do. Also in March, we got Yoshi Touch and Go, another gimmicky touchscreen game, but this time it was at least playable. This game is not winning any awards for innovation or being that fun, but it doesn't break my DS to play it, so that's at least a win. Every game begins with Baby Mario falling from the sky, held up by 3 balloons. Your goal is to draw clouds to help guide him to the ground safely. When he gets to the ground, Yoshi then picks him up, and then you go to the end of the stage. If this isn't reckless endangerment of a child, I have no idea what is. Also, who's still delivering babies by stork? It was an old wives' tale before the internet, and I have no idea how kids believe that.
Dad, how did I get here?
I don't know, a stork brought you or something. Now get out of here, I'm trying to watch reruns of Family Feud.
The highest award I could give this game is that it was fun for a car ride, but after that, I don't think there's a reason to try and go play it. In May, Puyo Pop Fever released. The only way I can really describe this is that if you took Dr. Mario and Tetris and took inspiration from both games while putting in some of the weirdest dubs of all time. The voice acting in this game is probably the corniest thing I've ever seen.
Hey, you there, in the deathly uncool clothes.
Who, me? I'll have you know I'm wearing only the finest clothes money can buy.
I love puzzle games, and this is no exception. If I play Puyo Pop Fever, I'm 100% of the time playing on the DS. I tried to play on the GameCube, but it's like chugging buttermilk. It doesn't work well and it made me feel awful. But if you want a game that's infinitely replayable and can get through whatever this is definitely still worth checking out. In June, we got Kirby Canvas Curse. This is not a typical Kirby game where you're sucking up enemies. This time, Kirby is a ball. And your goal is to draw lines to guide Kirby from point A to point B in a platformer where you have to draw a lot of rainbows. As far as Kirby games go, I'm not gonna say this is bad, but it doesn't really feel like a Kirby game. I will say it was a fun idea, and I like this a lot better than Kirby and the Rainbow Curse. And I was surprised about how much they actually fit into this game. But just like Pokemon Dash and Yoshi's Touch and Go, it just suffers from early DS syndrome, where the goal was more so to use the touchscreen than to make a game that was really fun. That's not saying it's bad like Pokemon Dash, but if I was recommending Kirby games, I would not pick this. August brought the now famous Nintendog series to fans across the world, and this game took over the world. This was the first massive casual game that released for the console, and it really pushed Nintendo a different direction. This was a weird split release with 3 separate games, each having a selection of different dog breeds you could have, but just by looking at the cover of this game, you can tell they were really trying to get moms to play. The goal was to attract a brand new audience of people over to the DS, and I think this was the perfect game to do that. Because look at it, it's dogs. And you might think this was just a moderate success, but no, it was the second best-selling game on the console. All of the versions included, it outsold Mario Kart DS.
We gotta get you working.
And I think this game was the exact moment that Nintendo realized they had an absolute monster on their hands. They now appealed to a market that had limited experience playing games. And they didn't have to make games that were super in-depth and innovative, it just had to appeal to pretty much anyone. But Nintendogs is fine, I don't think we're ever going to get another one. And honestly, that's probably a good thing. We also got the new game Pack and Roll, which was Pac-Man, but this time, he was a ball. You roll around any given level collecting pack dots, and once you collect enough, you're able to open the gate and move on. This was during the height of Pac-Man's identity crisis, and it really shows. That being said, I'm a man of taste, and I really like this game. It is extremely simple, but it is so much fun. It's exactly what I feel a new Pac-Man game should be like. It keeps the normal formula at heart, but changes just enough where it's fresh and innovative. I'm not sure who I need to send a fax to in order to get a new one of these, but I am prepared to stop at no lengths to get a new one. In October, we got a brand new Metroid game for the console, and before you get too excited like I did, it's not Metroid Prime Hunters, it's Metroid Prime Pinball.
You know, I can't do this anymore. There are a lot of things that I can take in this life, but that's not one of them. I'll see you in my memoirs.
I'll get this out of the way, it's a really good pinball game, but I really just wanted Metroid Prime Hunters. Looking back at both games, pinball is clearly the better game, but Nintendo has made so many pinball games for their IPs, so even though Metroid Pinball is up there with the best of them, at the time, it's just not what I wanted, but I guess looking back, it's one of the more addicting games on the console. Your goal while playing is to collect 12 different artifacts, and once you've collected them all, you get to play the last level where you get to play with 6 balls at the same time. It's chaotic, it's fun, it's endlessly replayable, and if you like Metroid, I'm sure you'll love it. But again, it's just pinball. In November, Sonic Rush released, and even though it's not the best Sonic game on the console, it's still really fun. The levels and music are on par with any other Sonic game you'll play, and the only real problem I have is that this game has some insane difficulty spikes that come seemingly out of nowhere, but after recently replaying it, I can say it still holds up to this day. When I revisited this, I expected it to control like Sonic had butter on his feet, but surprisingly, the game is still as crisp and fluid as ever. I can't say it's the best Sonic game on the console, but it's definitely far from bad. Next, we got one of the best games on the console, Mario Kart DS. This game had an absolute vice grip on children across the world. It took all the fun of the home console Mario Kart games and brought it to the DS. I like Super Circuit, but this was a whole nother level. The tracks, the soundtrack, and the mission mode were all incredible. It had an interesting roster of characters, including new ones like Dry Bones and Rob. It had a full mission mode, which was incredibly fun. But I think the best thing this game did was have some of the best karts in Mario Kart history. They had an excavator, a tractor, and a tank as selectable options. I can't imagine a tank is the most effective car to race in, but it's definitely the one with the most style points. Mario Kart DS kinda speaks for itself as being one of the best DS games ever made. It might be a basic pick, but it's still absolutely incredible. Next, we ended up getting Mario and Luigi Partners in Time, a sequel to the fan-favorite Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga on the Game Boy Advance. You get to play as Mario, Luigi, Baby Mario, and Baby Luigi, and though this does create some issues with platforming, I like how you could play as 4 characters in this. The best part of the game was definitely the story and the atmosphere of the world. It had an overall darker feeling than any of the other Mario and Luigi games, but the game's biggest issue was the boss fights. They would drag on for what felt like an eternity.
I think I have time to finish one more fight.
One eternity later. Beyond the final boss, the game was difficult but not overly punishing. Overall, it's a solid Mario RPG, not the best, but definitely not the worst. But the last major game for the year was Animal Crossing Wild World. This took all of the fun of Animal Crossing and brought it on the go, making it a lot easier to pick up and play for short sessions. It doesn't have as much content as any of the other Animal Crossing games, but for the time, it was an extremely innovative game. There isn't as much content as some of the newer Animal Crossing games, but the one thing this game has over most of the other Animal Crossing games is that all of the villagers have a lot of personality. Some villagers will be really nice and others will be jerks, and I miss that because now I don't feel as bad when I walk around whacking them with a net. Compared to other Animal Crossing games, I can't say I recommend this because I'm a certified New Leaf purist, but if you do end up playing this, it's not going to be a bad time. The first year on the market had some DS games that were really gimmicky and not worth it, and others that are still some of the best games on the console. But the DS was just getting started. 2006 was an incredible year for the console, and it started with Super Princess Peach in February. This was the exact opposite of a Mario experience, where this time Peach was rescuing Mario. It's a 2D platformer where you play as Peach with her parasol Perry, and it was the first game where Princess Peach took the limelight. Most of the gameplay has Peach using her emotions to solve environmental issues, but it ended up being so much more than that. Like any Mario platformer, you pick up coins throughout the game, but in this game, you can actually use the coins to buy upgrades. Peach has 4 vibes she can use, being Joy, Rage, Gloom, and Calm, each having their own effect, which either affects the world around her or Peach herself. This might not be the best Mario game to come out for the DS, but it's definitely one of the most underrated. March brought us another Pokémon game that wasn't a main series game, this time being Pokémon Troze. It's a puzzle matching game which the DS was full of, but this time you're matching Pokémon together. It's really just a simple and mindless puzzle game with Pokémon faces, but at least it wasn't a freemium gacha game, so I will take what I can get here. If you go in expecting anything more than a puzzle matching game, you're gonna be really disappointed. And although this game is really fun, it unfortunately wasn't even the best puzzle game to come out for the DS this month, with Tetris DS releasing, which is one of my favorite Tetris games and DS games ever made. I am nowhere near good enough at Tetris to say this is the best version, but it has Mario in it, so I'm 100% gonna be biased. The bottom screen has the typical Tetris gameplay you've come to know and love, and the top screen has some sort of Nintendo-themed game playing on the top. Having a bunch of different game modes, all themed off Nintendo games, was a great idea. So if you're a fan of Tetris or puzzle games at all, this is 100% worth checking out. And on the same day, we finally got Metroid Prime Hunters after almost 2 years. Overall, I can't say I hate this game, but I also don't think it's that great. The biggest issue I have is that the single player is extremely repetitive. Compared to the console version of the game, it's nowhere near as fun. Trying to use the DS's touchscreen in order to control the game was nowhere near as fluid as I think they wanted it to be. But the main draw of the game wasn't really the single player, it was more so focused on being the best multiplayer first-person shooter available for the console, and for the time, I think it did that pretty well. But the main issue is that this game was hyped up from the reveal of the console, with some launch day editions getting the demo, and then when the game actually came out, it was just kind of fine. I expected this to be a lot more fun than it was. And not being fun is one of the biggest crimes a game can commit.
That and vehicular manslaughter.
In April, we got yet another casual game with Brain Age Train Your Brain. I think this is a game that did extremely well because it was an educational game. Because what could be better than playing a video game about math problems?
Receiving open heart surgery in an alleyway.
Behind Nintendogs, this was the king of casual games. It had a bunch of different mini puzzles like Sudoku and math problems that kept your brain ripe and fresh. So if you were looking to play a game that helped you memorize your times tables, this might be the game for you. I think this game was bought by parents and grandparents who wanted their kids to play a game that was educational and helped them in school. And I get the sentiment, but receiving this as a child was a slap in the face.
Happy birthday, Straw Hat, I got you this gift. Thanks. Did you get me a loose copy of Brain Age?
This wasn't as much geared towards children as it was towards the casual adult gamer, who may want to pick up their kid's DS from time to time and play something simple. So I can't say this is a bad game, it's just not something that was made for me at the time. But when May rolled around, we got one of the heaviest hitters on the entire console with New Super Mario Bros. This was the first new Mario platformer since Super Mario Land 2, and it brought the series back to its roots for the first time in a long time. And this game was an absolute sensation. I'm pretty sure everyone has played at least one of the new Super Mario Bros. Games once in their life, but this was the one that made the world go absolutely crazy. It was all the fun of a standard 2D Mario game, except this time it was on the go. It had all of the tight platforming, addicting gameplay, and an incredible soundtrack that Mario was known for, but this time it had a 2.5D art style that made it feel like it was a true next-gen Mario experience. They ended up going on to make arguably too many new Super Mario Bros. Games, but this is the one that started the entire craze and honestly was one of the best DS games ever made. In September, we got Mario Hoops 3-on-3. This was a Mario basketball game where you use the touchscreen to dribble around and make your shots, and this is one of the most underrated Mario sports games of all time. This was developed by both Square Enix and Nintendo, and though it's not the most complicated Mario sports game out there, it's definitely one that is endlessly replayable. There were so many unlockables and challenges to complete that you would have a hard time sitting down and beating this. And the only real problem this game has is that it relied too much on the stylus. In Mario Sports Mix on the Wii, they had a better feeling basketball game, with gameplay that didn't absolutely destroy my DS's touchscreen, but they got rid of all of the fun unlockables and challenges this game had that made it really fun to play. So as much as I would recommend playing this game, I would also err on the side of caution and play it as gently as you possibly can. A week later, we got the first Pokémon Mystery Dungeon game, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team. It's a Pokémon Mystery Dungeon game. It's going to have an incredible story and infinitely replayable gameplay, but this is not the best Mystery Dungeon game. For being the first, it did a lot of things well, but it definitely is the one that feels the most aged. The biggest appealing factor is that you could play this an infinite number of times and never get bored. The story does not change depending on your playthrough, but all of the dungeons that you go through will. They aren't the most groundbreaking changes, but it's enough to keep the game interesting every time you play it. And compared to a lot of the early Pokemon titles, this had a story that was heartfelt, engaging, and really good all the way through. I am a sucker for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, so I think this game is worth checking out, even though you're going to have a better time if you get it on the Switch. Just over a month later, we got another Pokemon spin-off with Pokemon Ranger. This is an aptly titled Pokemon game where you play as a Pokemon Ranger and you get to help Pokemon in their native habitats. There's no battling in this game, you mostly just draw circles, so if you're into that, you're gonna have a great time. By capturing Pokemon, they become your buddy for a one-time use to help you with an environmental puzzle. I'm a big fan of Pokemon spin-off games, but this is not the best. There are two other Pokemon Ranger games which are far better than this. But as a proof of concept, this worked really well. The use of the touchscreen here was innovative, even if it could get really boring after a while. Overall, it had a decent story, and I can't say this is the best game on the console, but if you're into drawing circles, then you're going to have an incredible time. In November, we got Yoshi's Island DS, a sequel to the beloved Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo. I don't know why they didn't end up calling this Yoshi's Island 2, because when I hear the title Yoshi's Island DS, I assume it's a port of Yoshi's Island to the DS, not a brand new game like this is. It took the gameplay of the original Yoshi's Island but changed it enough where it felt like a new adventure. They added a bunch of new babies like Peach, Donkey Kong, and Wario, who all change up the gameplay experience in their own way. It can get extremely hard at times, especially in the latter half of the game, and that's a combination of the game just getting harder naturally and the controls not being that great. But overall, as a sequel to Yoshi's Island, I think it did a really good job. It came out the same year as New Super Mario Bros., so there was no shot this game was gonna do all that well. But as a sequel to one of my favorite games, I will say it's at least pretty good. The last major release for the year was Kirby Squeak Squad, which was definitely a video game. Unlike Canvas Curse, this is a standard Kirby game, and it plays just like a standard Kirby game would, but I think it has the dumbest premise of any video game I've ever played. Kirby was about to eat a piece of cake, and then it gets snatched, so he goes on an absolute rampage to get it back.
Hey, who ate my last slice of cake? I'll be honest, I have no idea. No, you wanna know what? Get over here.
No, what are you doing? Stop! Ow! Oh, ow, my butt! Kirby Squeak Squad is an incredibly bland game overall. It was incredibly short with nothing that made it really stand out from any other Kirby game ever made. It feels like they were halfway through making this game and they had to get it out the door, so they just released it as it was. This is one of the worst Kirby games ever made, not because it's bad, but because it's just so disappointing. But the biggest thing to happen to the DS in 2006 was the release of the DS Lite. When most people think of the DS, this is what pops into their brain because this is the model that sold the best. It was a smaller, lighter console with a better battery, better screens, and overall was just the best package you could get for the DS. It took everything that was great about the original model DS and made it better without removing anything that the original console had to offer, which made 2006 arguably the most important year for the console, with having the brand new rework, the release of New Super Mario Bros. DS, and the continued success of the console getting to as many hands as humanly possible, which led into 2007 incredibly well. In February, we got the release of Diddy Kong Racing DS, which even though it's not a better version than the N64 version, it got that game on a mobile console for the first time, even though there were some sacrifices that needed to be made for legal reasons. The biggest and most disappointing change is that Banjo and Conker are not in this version because Nintendo did not have the license for these characters.
Rare, on behalf of everyone who's ever played your games, I can't believe you've done this.
They got replaced by Dixie and Tiny Kong, which was fine, but this alone was enough to make this version not as good as the original. There were also a bunch of gameplay changes like losing the ability to barrel roll and flip, which honestly makes this feel like it's a half-baked version of the original game. Sure, it's fun being able to bring this game on the go, but it's not really the same game with all of the things they changed. I'm not gonna lie and say I don't like this version as well, but compared to the original, I just don't find it to be as engaging. In March, we got Wario Master of Disguise, one of the weirder Wario games ever made. It's a 2D platformer similar to the Wario Land games, but with enough changes to make everybody think,
Oh, Nintendo's finally going crazy, get the popcorn!
Wario had 8 different costumes, and in order to change them, you'd have to draw on the touchscreen, which I can't say was a bad idea at all, but I think a lot of people, including myself, were expecting this to be more like a Wario Land game than it ended up being. While I was playing, anytime I would need to change my costume, I would feel like I was having a stroke. Having to draw a symbol every single time you needed to change your character was far more frustrating than engaging, and overall the game was just pretty bland. It had a really good idea that I would love for them to revisit, but the execution just was not there. In April, we got the release of the first mainline Pokemon game for the console with Diamond and Pearl, and it definitely had some issues, but it was still a brand new Pokemon region, so as a 9-year-old, I was absolutely hooked. The Sinnoh region is one of the best regions in all of Pokemon, along with having some of the best starters in the entire series, but this game runs like a man without legs. It would take an incredibly long time to get through any of the battles, and they really tried to hammer in as many HMs as they possibly could, but if you could get past that, there were a ton of things to love about this game. It has one of the best stories in Pokemon history with Team Galactic, they introduced a bunch of incredible new Pokemon into the region, and it has arguably the best soundtrack in Pokemon history. A lot of people think Pokemon was at its peak during this era, and I don't think this is the best example of that, but I will say that Pokemon Diamond and Pearl will always hold a special place in my heart from purely nostalgia. Then in October, there was the release of The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass, which is the direct sequel to Wind Waker that a lot of people were asking for, but I don't think they were asking for this. A lot of things in this game work really well. It has some really great dungeons and boss fights that keep the game interesting, and even though the movement is a little wonky at first, you end up getting used to it fairly quickly. And using the touchscreen to do spin attacks might not be the most ideal way to do things, but it really doesn't work all that badly. The biggest thing this game suffers from is being overall just decent. Also the pan flute, that is really dumb and I hate every time I have to use it. As a sequel to Wind Waker, there's a lot to be desired, but as a 2D Zelda game available on the DS, they didn't do a bad job. We also got Chibi Robo Park Patrol, which was a great Chibi Robo game for the DS. It took all the fun of the original Chibi Robo on the GameCube, but instead of cleaning a house, this time you're building the perfect park. I hope you like planting flowers because you're going to be doing that a lot in this game, but honestly, it's better than Ziplash, which is all I can ever ask for. They did a really good job in Park Patrol of blending different types of games together to make one overall complete package. It didn't matter if you were defending your park or if you were building it up to be beautiful. Everything in this game felt like it had purpose and was well thought out. It's a shame Chibi Robo will probably not get a new game anytime soon, but if they do, I want it to be more like this and less like this. In November, we got the best mobile Mario Party of all time with Mario Party DS, which is not only a great DS game, it's also one of the best Mario parties ever made. It had a bunch of great game modes, including a story mode and a boss rush, which made this have more content than a lot of other games in the series. It had really great themes and boards, which made the game even more engaging. And it plays just like a typical Mario Party game, but this time you can play it wherever you go. Mario Party DS was the last game before the series entered its dark age, and honestly, this is the best game they could have made before going absolutely insane. But overall, 2007 wasn't the strongest year for the DS, and I'm sure there are a bunch of reasons for this, but the most notable to me is that the Wii released at the end of 2006, and a lot of developers shifted their focus towards making Wii games as opposed to making DS games. But there were still some great games like the Phantom Hourglass, Mario Party DS, and Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, which made sure the DS was not pushed to the wayside just yet. But this led into 2008, which was another pretty good year for the console. The first major release was in January with Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games coming to the DS. Mario and Sonic at the Olympics was definitely one of the more unique series that came to the console, and for the original, I prefer playing on the DS more than playing on the Wii. There was something great about bringing all of these micro Olympic events with Mario and Sonic characters on the go, and the way they made a lot of these games work well on the touchscreen was great. I can't say this is the best Mario and Sonic game or the best DS game, but if you were looking for something to kill time, this was a great way to do it. In April, we got the release of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time and Darkness, which were improvements on the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games in every possible way. Everything was just better. The story, the graphics, the gameplay. From start to finish, it was an incredible game, and it was the game that made me really fall in love with the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. There is a third version called Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky, which came out a year later and is the premier way to play this, but it doesn't matter if you pick up the original two or the deluxe version, you're gonna have a great time. In September, there was Kirby Superstar Ultra, which is probably the best Kirby game on this console, even though it's just an enhanced version of a different Kirby game for the Super Nintendo. All of the games available in Superstar Ultra are a good time. Some are better than others, but none of them are so terrible it would make you go, "Oh my god!"
Oh, it's just Kirby.
As an enhanced remake of Superstar, there were a lot of changes they made to the game to make it more visually appealing and just play better. But as far as value goes, this is an absolute steal. It doesn't matter what game you're playing, you're gonna have a great time with most of them. Of all the Kirby games on the DS to recommend, this is the one that I would say is the best. In November, we got Pokemon Ranger Shadows of Almia, the best Pokemon Ranger game. Everything that was great about the original Pokemon Ranger was enhanced in this, especially the amount of circles you have to draw. The story compared to the original is so much better, and even though it starts off a little bit slow, once you get into the meat and potatoes of the game, it is phenomenal. Though it's a lot simpler than the main series games, it's one of the best side series Pokemon has ever made. And it's a shame it was only available on the DS because they tried to push Pokemon Ranger in the anime and in the other mainline games. But it's a shame that this series didn't get as much attention as Mystery Dungeon, because honestly, they're both great in their own ways. This might be the only time I have ever said this sentence before, but if they brought this series back as a mobile game, I think it would do incredibly well. You know, as long as they don't have a bunch of gacha mechanics. Also in November, Chrono Trigger got brought over to the console, which is one of the best things that has ever happened to me. I picked up this game as a kid, not knowing anything about it, and I fell in love. Now, having played this on both the Super Nintendo and the DS, it's much better to play on the Super Nintendo, but it doesn't matter how you play it, it's one of the best RPGs of all time, and it's available on the go. Beyond the mobility, the main draw of the DS version is the extra content, which is honestly hit or miss. I'm not going to complain about having more Chrono Trigger to play, but none of the content screams this is the definitive version. But I can say, no matter how you play it, Chrono Trigger is one of the best games ever made, and if you haven't played it, please go out and do it immediately. But overall, 2008 was a pretty decent year for the console. The DS was still doing incredibly well, even though there weren't as many impactful games that came out this year. But having a new Mystery Dungeon, a new Pokemon Ranger, and getting Chrono Trigger all in the same year was a great time. But that led into 2009, where we got a bunch of incredible games, starting off in February with Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. Shadow Dragon is a remake of the original Fire Emblem game, and honestly, it's not my favorite Fire Emblem, but that doesn't mean it's bad. The story left a lot to be desired and didn't really scratch any of the itches the other Fire Emblem games did, but I will say gameplay-wise, it is still incredibly fun. Marth is arguably the most iconic Fire Emblem character of all time, and getting to hear his backstory was really nice. And not having to slug through the original Fire Emblem to do it is even better. But if I was recommending Fire Emblem games, I don't think this would be anywhere near the top 5, but it was available on the DS, so I can't complain all that much. If you're a fan of Fire Emblem, this is an overlooked game that I think you should check out. In March, we got the release of Pokemon Platinum version, which is the deluxe version of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, and it improved pretty much every issue with Diamond and Pearl and made this the best way to experience Sinnoh to date. All of the changes that were added to Diamond and Pearl, like the physical and special split and the new region, are all kept, but this time the story is way better paced. All of the gym leaders have Pokemon of their original typing, because for some reason they didn't in Diamond and Pearl. The regional Pokédex has a better selection of Pokemon, and there's the whole Distortion World section, which is new to the game and makes it even more eerie and dark than it already was. Though Diamond and Pearl ended up being kind of disappointing, Platinum came around and fixed almost every single issue I have with them, making not only one of the best Pokemon games on the DS, but one of the best Pokemon games of all time. In September, we got Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story, one of the best Mario RPGs of all time. Bowser's Inside Story is a game that I like to use as proof that Mario could pretty much do anything and still make a good game, because the concept of this game is insane. Mario and Luigi are stuck inside Bowser's body, and they have to figure out how to get out, all while Bowser goes on his own journey, which means you get 2 adventures for the price of 1, and honestly, both of them are really good. Mario and Luigi's art style on the DS was incredible, and I think this is one of the best looking DS games to me. The 2D pixel art style was really good here, and they made all of the characters look really expressive the entire time you're playing. And with a lot of games going for 3D at the time, it was great there were some series that didn't try and make that jump just yet. The combination of RPG mechanics with real-time button presses is extremely fun and engaging, and beyond the concept alone, it still has a bunch of the fun wackiness that all of the Mario RPG series are known for. This is one of the few DS games I consider a must-play, and if you haven't checked it out yet, I highly recommend it. And it doesn't matter if you play on the DS or the 3DS, they're both a good time, even though the DS version is better. In September, we also got one of my favorite DS games of all time, Kingdom Hearts 358 Days Over 2, which I will be honest is the worst DS game name of all time.
I really think it's time to make Kingdom Hearts 3.
Yeah, that idea is fine, except for that it sucks, so we should do a DS game that has a fraction in the name.
I am a huge fan of the Kingdom Hearts games, and this is one of my favorites of all time. It has one of the best stories in the entire series and some of the best characters to boot. Gameplay-wise, it could be better, but it's also on the DS, so beggars can't be choosers. But it took what was great about the Kingdom Hearts games on the home console and brought it on the go. And yeah, I know there was one for the Game Boy Advance too, but we don't talk about that. I could go on for days about how much I love the Kingdom Hearts games, and I'm sure I will at some point, but even if you haven't played them, I still recommend checking this out because it is just incredibly fun. It is somehow a perfect mixture of Disney, Final Fantasy, and convoluted storytelling that makes you have a good time regardless if you know what's going on or not. But I think the most important thing for the DS in 2009 was the release of the DSi, a brand new model of the DS that added a bunch of new things but also took away some great things about the original. Now, the biggest issue with the DSi is that it no longer has the Game Boy Advance cartridge slot, which meant if you had this, you could only play DS games.
Oh no! How am I gonna watch SpongeBob on this now?
And this alone was enough to deter me from getting this console for a pretty long time after it released. But it did bring some brand new things to the table that weren't available on the original DS, like the entire suite of online features, including the DSi Store, which allowed you to buy a bunch of smaller digital games, and a bunch of other new features that made this not the best version of the DS, but definitely not the worst. It had a camera, for crying out loud. It's gotta be at least somewhat decent. And 2009 was not a bad year for the console at all, but it was around this time that we started getting rumors about a successor system coming in the future. It was still a pretty long way away, but the 3DS was on the horizon, which meant a lot of the games that were releasing started to slow down, which led directly into 2010, which was another pretty solid year for the console. It started off pretty slow, but in March we got the release of the Sonic Classic Collection, which included 4 of Sonic's most famous early adventures, all available on the DS for the first time. Now, as much as I think this is a great deal, there were some issues if you had an older model of the DS, where I noticed if I play this on my DS as opposed to my DSi, I'm gonna have some issues. Nothing that's all that groundbreaking, but enough to make me want to snap my DS in half. But just having the ability to play these games on the go was enough for me. If you're a fan of classic Sonic games, there are way better ways to play it. But if you want to play it on the DS for some reason, this is not a bad time. Also in March, we got the release of Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, 2 of the best Pokemon games ever made. And there's a reason why people say the DS had the best era of Pokemon, and this is a main point of it. It took Pokemon a while to get going on the DS because they just kept releasing side games before they ended up releasing a main series game. But once they started, they were on a generational run. Heart Gold and Soul Silver were remakes of the original Gold and Silver, with a bunch of quality of life improvements that made this the premier way to play Johto to this day, including but not limited to the ability to walk with any Pokemon behind you, including their shiny form, the physical and special split, an improved story that implemented notes from Pokemon Crystal, and so much more. As far as Pokemon remakes go, these are some of the best of all time, and as much as I love the original Gold and Silver, if I want to play Johto, I'm reaching for these instead. In November, we got Sonic Colors, arguably the best Sonic game on the console. Now, this came out during a time where a company would release 2 separate games with the same name, and though I usually found that the home console version would be a bit better, this was a night and day difference, and honestly, I think Colors on the DS was the better version. Maybe it's because I went in with pretty low expectations, but I was honestly really impressed with this game. It followed the exact same story as the Wii version, but honestly I think the gameplay just worked a lot better being a purely 2D Sonic game than trying to jump back and forth between 2D and 3D segments. In my personal opinion, I think this is one of the best Sonic games ever made for a handheld console. And in my opinion, if you could only play Sonic Colors one way, I would recommend the DS over the Wii and the Switch.
I call blasphemy!
In November, we got Mario vs. Donkey Kong Mini Land Mayhem, which is definitely a game that came out for the DS. Not to sound like a broken record, but the Mario vs. Donkey Kong games are just fine. This was the second Mario vs. Donkey Kong game for the DS, and honestly, both of them are alright. This was the first game in the series to really change the gameplay a good amount, and instead of toggling blocks and buttons for the minis in the other games, this time it's more focused on drawing paths and bridges to help safely guide your minis to the goal. I'm not going to tell you these games are bad because they're not, but I just have a hard time enjoying them when there are both better puzzle games and better Mario games on the console. 2010 was the last full year of the DS's reign on the market, with the 3DS coming in early 2011, but that didn't mean they were done making great games for it, because this bad boy kept getting games well into the release of the 3DS. But you can tell starting in 2010, they started to slow down quite a bit, because a lot of companies started shifting their focus towards the 3DS and leaving the DS to the wayside. And with 2011 rolling around, there was only a couple notable releases for the console that came out during this year. The first being Pokémon Black and White, which were absolutely incredible games. It's crazy to think that Pokémon Black and White released just a few weeks before the 3DS did in North America, and the fact that these weren't the last main series Pokémon games on the console says a lot about how well Pokémon was preparing at this time. But Pokémon Black and White were absolutely incredible games. The story is the best Pokémon has ever had, touching on some dark philosophical themes that really make you wonder about the Pokémon world more than any other Pokémon game. They had a brand new selection of Pokémon for this game that were the only Pokémon usable until you beat the game, meaning for the first time ever you weren't able to bring your favorite Pokémon with you until you beat the game. The Unova region is one of the best regions in all of Pokémon, where even though it has an extremely linear structure, it's still full of life and color. The characters you meet along the way are some of the best in the entire Pokémon series, and it has an incredible post-game that is fun all the way through. At the time, people were really skeptical about Gen 5, especially the fact that you couldn't bring your favorite Pokémon into the new region, but I think as time's gone on, people really appreciate how great this region truly was. Was it a weird idea to start a new Pokémon generation at the end of a console's life cycle? Absolutely. But honestly, I am really glad they did. In September, we got Kirby Mass Attack, which answered the age-old question, what if Kirby jumped King Dedede? This Kirby game I think has fallen under the radar, and honestly, I think it's a great time. You can control up to 10 Kirbys at any given time, and honestly, I think that is the best idea Kirby has had in a long time. The gameplay involves using the DS's stylus on the touchscreen, and honestly, I didn't think that was gonna work as well as it did, but honestly, it worked pretty well, and it didn't take away from the gameplay experience at all. I can't think of another way to control 10 Kirbys that wouldn't drive me up a wall, but as far as gimmicky Kirby games on the DS go, this is by far my favorite. I would love for Nintendo to do something new with this idea, even though I don't really know how they would do it, but I'm willing to be patient and wait until they finally do it. But in March, we got the release of the 3DS, officially bringing the DS's life cycle to a close. Kind of. There were still a couple more DS games that came out in 2012 for some reason because the DS just would not die. I think it's because it had an incredibly large install base and a lot of those people weren't upgrading to the 3DS because of a less than stellar launch. So at the time, it made a lot of sense to keep these games coming out for the DS to keep their fans happy. And one company in particular really took that to heart, and that was the Pokémon Company, releasing 3 games during the year 2012 that could have released for the 3DS but ended up just being DS games. The first being Pokémon Conquest. This is a tactical RPG set in the world of Pokémon, and it works incredibly well. As far as tactical RPGs go, this has a pretty fast pace. Though this was a weird game to start, once you get the hang of it, it is an extremely fun time, and the battles don't lock you in like other tactical RPGs where you're sitting there for 6 to 8 hours wondering how you got in this situation in the first place. The game is more difficult than the standard Pokémon experience, but that's not a bad thing. If you're a fan of games like Fire Emblem or Advanced Wars, you're gonna have a great time with this. But if you were like me and got this as a child, you probably were really confused about why Pokemon looked so weird. But playing it recently, knowing what I know now, I actually really enjoy this game, and I think it's one of the best Pokemon spin-offs of all time. I would love for the Pokemon Company to revisit this idea with either a brand new game or an enhanced port for the Switch, but honestly, playing this on my DS will do just fine for now. And the last major game that came out for the DS was Pokémon Black and White 2. And for being the last major release for this console, I can't think of a better game to do it. When this game was announced, I only had one thought, and that was,
guess I'm not paying rent this month.
The The most common complaint about Pokemon Black and White was that people wanted to use their favorite Pokemon in a Pokemon game, which honestly I can't blame them for because I also missed having Bellsprout on my team. But instead of opting to make a deluxe version like Pokemon Gray, they made a direct sequel which continued the story of the original game, which I thought was a brilliant idea. Black and White already had the best story in the series, so when I heard that we were getting more of that, I knew that we were in for a great time. And everything they added to Black and White 2 felt like an enhancement. It added on to the already incredible Unova region, getting to explore new areas along with getting to see what changed in the 2 years that passed. There was the Pokemon World Tournament, which was the best side mode in all of Pokemon, and though the story itself wasn't as good as the original, getting more of it was still a great time. From Platinum all the way to Black and White 2, the DS had some incredible Pokemon games, and having this be the last one released was the perfect way to send the series off into the world of the 3DS. But having a bunch of games from 2004 to 2012 made the DS one of the longest lasting handhelds Nintendo's ever had, and to me I think it's one of the most important consoles ever made. It was the first Nintendo console that focused on getting the casual gamer into the world of video games, and overall it created memories for millions of people across the world. If I were to have talked about every DS game I know and love, this video would be 10 hours long, but let me know in the comments if I missed your favorite game. And as always, thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible rest of your day, and if you like anything that you saw here, please consider subscribing.